I've spent the week talking to floor managers, supporting artists and stuntmen, but now I'm delighted to be joined by the man at the top of what I think was Tom Baker's best time on Doctor Who. I would like to introduce producer Philip Hinchcliffe. How are you?
Hi, Alex. I'm very well, thank you.
I wanted to take you back to not just Doctor Who, but the early days of producing. And say, before we talk Who, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what a day in the life of a producer is at the BBC.
Well, I better talk about my time because I haven't been doing anything there for a long time. I mean, I have been down to the Doctor Who, setup at Cardiff, and of course, it's very different to the way I did it. I think a lot of the fans understand the difference between filming and the old studio recording way of doing programs, which is what we did, but maybe they don't. So although today Doctor Who is shot on lightweight, digital cameras, which are just the same really as like a film camera. I think a lot of movies are shot that way as well. And basically they do it like movies. In other words, each scene or shot within a scene usually has a separate setup. So it's like filming. So in other words, you get the actors, say two of them together, and you probably do a wide shot, then you do a over the shoulder one way, over the shoulder the other way, and then maybe close up one, and close ups. So you might have 5 setups just to cover a small scene, and then if it's a longer scene, you'd have more, and an action scene would be completely different. But that's just giving you. So in other words, you film a little bit, stop, reset, start again, and all the rest of it. So that's like filming. And so the reason I'm saying this is the schedule of a producer on a filmed series is different to the way we did it. So Chris Chibnall and all his gang, I don't know what they allocate to an hour's show, but it'll be so many days, 8 days or something like that, and then they've got post-production, and prior to that they've had pre-production. So he'll have a number of directors, staggered. One will be in pre-production, the other one will be filming, the other one will be in post-production. Well, that's what we did as well. The big difference is that we used to, our production days were 2 days in the studio at White City, where we had multi-cameras, big old things, twice the size of a Dalek, moving around like Daleks. And so we would have a fortnight's rehearsal in the rehearsal rooms with the actors, and then we'd take it and block it for the technicians in the studio in the mornings, and then we would record. In the old days, we then would record in the evening at 7:30 until 10 o'clock. So we would be capturing the performance of the actors, that they were almost like giving us a stage performance with all the moves and everything. And the cameras would be continually moving around and cross-shooting. And the editing effectively was done by the vision mixer up in the gallery. Rather than making a film, it's the editor who cuts one, although they don't splice film in these digitally, they edit these days, but that's the big difference. So our my daily, I had different daily experiences. So in pre-production, there'd be talking to all the heads of departments, getting the story ready on time, finessing the script with Bob Holmes and everybody, and then we'd have a read through. So that would be a different day. Then they'd go into rehearsal. There might be a bit of pre-filming as well, and sometimes no filming. Now and again, 3 or 4 days for a story. We might travel a long way, but usually we didn't. We did for the Mask of Mandragora. Obviously, we went to Wales. And then we would, at the end of the sort of 10 days rehearsal, 12 days rehearsal, we then go in for our 2 studio days, and then we'd repeat that again. So that would be our production. And then that would go into production in our days, it was just editing and the sound and dubbing and put the music on. So I would have 26 episodes, so about 6 stories going over a season, say 6 months or 8 months really. And so I would have, my day could be anything really. The one thing would be that I would always be at the production in the studio day. I would always be there. I'd always be at read through. I would always be at 1 or 2 rehearsal days. And then around that, I'd fit my script meetings with production people trying to explain the vision of what we're trying to do. And then afterwards looking at the edited program and maybe making suggestions for that. So there was, every day was almost different really. But it followed that sort of pattern through about 8 months.
So did that structure allow you to perhaps be more of a physical presence during the actual recording than perhaps today a producer is?
Probably, yes, because you are actually, I don't know whether producers do, but the old way of doing it was that the director was the man who was making the show. So he'd be in the gallery in the old days, and right next to him would be the vision mixer, because basically they are creating the pictures there and then, and talking to the studio manager, and they used to call them PAs in the BBC just to confuse things, but the person who was directing the actors and the cameras on the floor was like the director's deputy down on the floor, but the director was usually up in the gallery. But a lot of directors used to go on the floor as well, and some of them more than others, but basically the pictures were up in the gallery. So, and then he had his production sort of continuity lady up there as well as the vision mixer, and then there'd be sound and lighting and all that. So you wouldn't really sit right next to your director or breathe over his shoulder. It wasn't the way we did it. So there was a little producer's room overlooking the gallery, and so that's where you would be. But if you did want to go and give him a note during the production, or something, you could nip in and do that.
So in terms of the BBC at the time when you started on Doctor Who, it must have been probably one of the more challenging jobs, because there's model shots, there's location studio, you've got special effects. It's got all the elements that not all productions had.
All the elements that can go wrong. Absolutely, and we had to do. We had a bit of pre-filming for model shots and things, but a lot of our effects had to happen in real time, and in the studio anyway, definitely. And so it was very hit and miss, and it was a nightmare show to direct. That's why you couldn't get directors to do it. They were scared, and it was very difficult. Yeah, it was. But funnily enough, I talked to the directors today, a few years ago, when the show came back, and I said, "Oh, it must be very different to you, not the same pressures that we had or my directors had." And they said, "Oh, yes, we do, and not enough money, not enough time." And they talked me through it, and they are just as squeezed in a way. And it's still, even with all their post-production, digital effects they can now do, which we had none of those. They are still up against it, the directors who do it today, because of the time and the budget. And they're always, they said, we hope we've got everything. We just throw it, into editing and hope that we get enough out of it, So I think they're riding a tightrope as well, really, the way my directors were.
And you mentioned you'd been to the studios and met Chris Chibnall. Did that sort of feel like the same program you'd worked on, or was it sort of totally worlds apart?
Well, it was worlds apart, as I said at the beginning, by the fact it's more like a film series now, and a lot of we had, every story was a serial, at least usually 2, 4, mainly 6. 4 or 6. whereas they have, well, not Chris Chibnall, but when it first came back, they've either done single films or maybe 2 parts. I don't know that they've done anything much longer than that. So there isn't quite got that, it hasn't quite got that serial feel that it, you know, the narrative had in my day. And of course it's I think the style of storytelling and cinematic storytelling is more filmic and faster and quicker, you know, and that's what the modern, you know, young viewers are used to. That's what they're brought up on. So there's a different style to it. So that felt very different. I mean, talking to Chris Chibnall and some of his writers, they still seem to be battling with the same sort of problems we had. How do you tell an adventure story within certain constraints? How do you get the climaxes in the story? At what point do you do that, etc., etc., you know, cliffhangers. And it's so when we started talking about that, there was a lot of similarities. I thought, oh yeah, this is still the same show, you know.
And I suppose we should talk about the latest Blu-ray that's come out, season 14, because I'm all right in thinking this is probably quite a distant memory, making the behind the sofa and all the special features for that.
Well, no, I did those. Well, in the last few months, haven't I? Do you mean that was the program a distant memory?
So was the behind the scenes, all the special features, were they done quite a while ago and only now are they coming out?
Yeah, they were done at the end of last year, I think, most of them, or the beginning. Yeah, towards the end of last year, or throughout last year and at the end of the year, yeah. I think I did 3. There was the Tony Cash interview about who's Doctor Who, and then there was the interview with Matthew Sweet, and then there's the On the Sofa thing. I haven't seen that, which because I haven't got my copy of the Blu-ray at the minute, so I don't know how that's come out. But I think that's all I did. They're quite long features.
Yes, and particularly the interview with Matthew Sweet is a lovely feature.
Oh, good. You enjoy that? Great.
So
Can't remember what I said now.
But when someone says, I would like to talk to you about season 14, are your years on Doctor Who, do you think of them as solo years, or is it all sort of one large memory rather than sort of divided into 3?
No, I think I do remember it's three seasons, yeah, because they were, you know, you definitely managed a season, and then you had a short break, but you already were thinking of the next season. So yeah, you did think in terms of a yearly output, really.
And of course, that the first season there was that sort of handover almost from Barry Letts.
Yeah, there was.
What do you feel is perhaps your most confident series?
Sorry, what was my most confident series?
Of the 3, you know, if you had to choose one year in terms of Doctor Who, which do you feel was your most confident, that you were really doing the stories that you wanted to do?
Well, probably nearer the end of it. Yeah, probably the last season. I mean, every season had, you know, winners and losers in my mind. Things I wasn't happy with, but I think on balance, I think the last season I did was, you know, probably got the best stories in it, or you know, it was a good season, I think. Anyway, put it like that.
Yeah, certainly a fantastic, you know, season for Tom and the series. And when you start pre-production for any job, not just Doctor Who, where does it start? Is it you as a producer going, I would like to do a story with this genre or exploring this, or does it come from the script editor? How does that process begin?
Well, it can start in all those ways that you mentioned, and I suppose over my career, probably all of those instances apply. I've originated quite a lot of shows, either because I've just had an idea in my head, you know, maybe have written it as well, or, you know, if not written the scripts as well, or some of the scripts, or maybe like Bust, for example, or I may have come up with an idea for like Nancy Astor, and or else I would have heard of an idea that somebody gave me, like Friday on My Mind, which we made down in Wales. And I took that idea and then, found a writer and built it up. Other occasions, I've been given a script. I was given the Charmer scripts, or the early ones anyway, for the London Weekend with Nigel Haver's series. The same with Private Schultz. That was ready made and written, really. I mean, so I was lucky enough to be given those scripts. Jack Pullman had died, but they were wonderful scripts, and so I think, but nonetheless, there was a lot to do with that show to get it right. The casting, the tone of the show, simply just physically achieving to do it with all the filming all around, the British Isles, trying to pretend we're in Germany and places like that. So Austria, I mean, and then obviously I was handed Doctor Who, which was, the formula was handed to me, but not any stories except for the first season. There were a few stories underway. So I brought a lot of my own imaginative ideas to that, working well with Bob Holmes. So I've been the sort of producer, and I haven't named all my shows, but I've always, some shows I've had a lot of shaping or choosing. Virtuoso, which was about the life of John Ogden, a famous concert pianist who had mental illness problems. And I'd read a book. I read the book, and I optioned the book. And so from getting the book, then you've got to build it from there. So I've liked that side of producing a lot. Being on the ground floor. And either inventing the idea myself or shaping things right from early on, But on the other hand, some of the best shows I've done, I've been given the projects, There you go.
I suppose that's the joy of being a producer. Each series is totally different, hopefully, anyway.
Well, I think it was in the era that I worked, because I did about 11 years at the BBC, and I turned a lot of shows. I mean, I was offered quite a number of shows to produce, which I turned down actually in my career. You don't do everything people offer you. You have to have some affinity with, well, unless you just want to make money. You need an affinity with it. You want to feel you can put your stamp on it. And I think that in the era that I worked, the 70s and the 80s, in the BBC, it was the best of times for a producer, really, because you could develop, get development funding, you could develop ideas, try them out, you could have this great sort of choice of material in a way, and you were left alone to be the sole kind of arbiter of the show. When the head of department said, right, go ahead, after you sold in the idea you wanted to do it, or he said to you, would you please produce this for us? And you said, oh yeah, Private Schultz, yeah, why, I'll do that. Thank you very much. But once that's happened, and they probably want to know the key star casting, after that they kind of left you alone, and you came back a year later or 6 months later with the program and showed it to them, and they might have seen a bit of filming on the way, but not a lot. And or studios, they might have seen some of the studio stuff if we were doing it in the studio. But basically, you were left to make the show, and then you didn't have anybody looking over your shoulder. Whereas today, you've got how many executive producers, I don't know, up the tree and all the rest of it, and everybody's over your shoulder. It must be a nightmare being a producer, really. Although I think what's come through is that the writer-producers kind of can call the shots a bit, like Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat. So going back to Doctor Who as an example, they've become the sort of exec producers, but they're really creative producers of the show, But in my day, we were left alone without anybody looking over our shoulders. It was great.
So in that instance, bringing in a character like Leela, who was such a contrast to Sarah Jane, you wouldn't have had to get approval or sort of fight for that. That was what you felt was needed for the show, and you could just get on with it.
Yeah, no, but I think I can't remember exactly the details, but I would have, out of courtesy, you know, the Doctor you wouldn't cast without the head of series being part of it. They might even come up with the idea, like Bill Slater did. He suggested Tom Baker. It wasn't me that cast him. So yeah, no, the Doctor's companion is a very big role. So you wouldn't just go and do that without involving, in my day, the head of series. I should think Chris Chibnall has sort of how many people he has to please. You know, how many people poke their finger into that decision, I don't know. So I think we had it easier, but yeah, no, that would have been it's a major casting decision, you know.